Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon at this point in the day. Hello, I'm Denise White. I am the Engagement and Communications Manager with the Colorado Municipal League, and we are excited today to be bringing you a webinar that's of great interest to many. So thank you, first and foremost, for attending the webinar today. We know how busy everybody can get, and especially this time of year, and so really appreciate you choosing to spend that time learning with us today, with our presenters as well, who are gracious to give their time as well. For those of you who are elected officials who have registered you will be receiving one university training credit for attending today. We also want to make sure everybody knows that we are recording the session today. So today's presentation will be posted on our website. That's www.cml.org, and we'll be posting that under training materials. That will be put there probably later at the tail end of this week, and we'll send out an email reminder, let everybody know when it's available. For those of you who are new to our platform today, just want to give you a quick housekeeping walkthrough of the tools available to you. If you look, you should see a control panel to the top right of your screen. You'll see like a little orange arrow on the left side of that panel. If you click on that, that will minimize or maximize the box so you have available tools to use there for you. We are asking our participants stay muted for the webinar just so that we can focus on what our presenters are saying. And we will be using the question box and chat tool for you to follow if you've got questions or chat to share during the conversation. We do have a presentation on the front end, but we will be opening this up for Q&A towards the end of the session. So please feel free to type in any questions that come to you as you think of them through the presentation. Also wanted to make sure, I think we'd sent out a handout in advance. City of Golden staff here and our presenters thought it might be helpful for you to see that in advance, but we've also added that to a handout section in that toolbar. That will also be added to our website when we post these materials there later in the week. So without further ado, we're going to dive into our presentation today. And I'd like to introduce I'll do a quick introduction of our presenters, and then we're going to kick it over to Mayor Laura Weinberg, who can share a little more information. But today you're joining us for the Housing Needs Assessment, How To with the City of Golden. We'll be walking you through a life cycle of a housing needs assessment, and hopefully you'll be learning here what to expect when you undertake a housing needs assessment in your own community, from the why to the RFP process to community outreach, the next steps in the implementation. But to tell you more about that and to introduce her staff, I want to say thank you to Mayor Laura Weinberg, who's here from the City of Golden. She's also a member of our CML's Executive Board. I'll turn it over to you now, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Glad you could join us. I can't see any of you, so not sure who's joining us today, but thanks for tuning in. And Denise, would you go to the next slide just so we can do some introductions? So as Dee said, I'm Laura Weinberg. I'm the mayor for the City of Golden. And with me today is also Janet Maccubbin, who's our Affordable Housing Policy Coordinator. And she's going to do most of the talking about the Housing Needs Assessment. And then also we have Rick Muriby, who is our Director of Community Development. So when we first put this webinar together, which was, I think I initially talked, I'm on the CML Executive Board and on the Housing Committee, and we first talked about some webinars, I think last fall or towards the end of last year, and I was really excited because we had just been completing our Housing Needs and Strategies Assessment, and so we talked about doing a webinar for CML for other cities who are in the middle of the process or thinking about going forward. Of course, the timing is interesting this week with the legislature, talking a lot about housing and potentially requiring some housing needs and strategies assessments. So hopefully what we have to share in the process that we've gone through will be helpful to all of you as you kind of move forward in your own cities. I'm not going to talk about the bill at all. I know we're all probably really tired about talking about the bill, but I think that the excitement I had when we completed our assessment last fall has continued. I'm going to give you a little bit of history about what Golden has done around housing over time, and then hopefully share a little bit about why I'm so encouraged about what we're doing now. So thank you. So really, Golden has known we've had a challenge with housing going back at least 15 years. We are a land constrained city. We can't expand in terms of greenfield development. It's all infield. We also have more jobs in the city than we have residents, and a college campus that attracts thousands of students. So we have for a long time had more people wanting to live in Golden than we've had housing. And back in 2010, we adopted what we call our Golden Vision 2030, and included in there in our guiding principles for our city is a statement that says we want diverse housing options to provide opportunity to a wide spectrum of residents. So that's kind of our guiding principle around housing. We adopted it a number of years ago, and we really hold that as foundational for what we're trying to do. And as a city, we do continue to work on preserving housing, improving the quality of our existing housing stock, and updating our zoning to make adding new housing a little easier. But I'm going to talk about, and really what our housing assessment focuses on is housing that is affordable. So really diving into that aspect of the housing conversation. And what I wanted to share is that as a city over the years, really, I think the first thing that I was involved in or knew about was back in 2008. We have tried a number of techniques and different structures to make progress towards that guiding principle of diverse housing for a wide spectrum of residents. So the city convened an affordable housing task force. Our planning commission took up the topic of affordable housing and over the years has worked and talked about different aspects. We have a community group here in the city that partnered with the city on some outreach and education and opportunities for residents to learn more about housing, and in particular, affordable housing. At a point in time, the city hired a contract employee for a couple of years to work on quantifying our affordable housing needs, and that led to City Council adopting a comprehensive plan update with affordable housing goals back in 2017. So we've talked about it a lot. We've tried different things, community groups, city groups, outside assistance. We've seen some successes. We have our regional housing authority that in that time has been able to build a couple of projects that are rental housing units, one that is dedicated to seniors and one that is for all ages. But we've really seen incremental success, really small additions of affordable housing units or income qualified housing units being added in the city. So I was on city council, so I was part of a lot of this before I became mayor in January of 2020, and I came in with a focus on housing of how are we actually going to move the needle, how are we going to focus on actions that will make a difference. And I started in January 2020, so we had a little delay as our housing efforts really went towards helping people stay at their existing housing as we were going through COVID. But we were still able to, after we got through 2020, focus a little bit more on these housing goals. And in 2021, I worked with our city council to approve the hiring of a full-time housing policy coordinator. And that's when we were able to bring Janet on board with the city in a full-time position in the second half of 2021. And at the same time, we also were moving forward applying for the grants that DOLA made available for the Housing Needs and Strategies Assessment. So we started all of that work towards the end of 2021. And that focus of having a staff, a new staff person dedicated to this and having this opportunity with some funding to do a full-scale housing needs and strategies assessment really brought a lot of the previous efforts together. And because we had had so many conversations in the community over the years, both discussions as well as education, during all of these various efforts, we were able to engage a number of community members pretty quickly as we started our work on the assessment. But what we had lacked before, and why I'm so excited with what we have now, is we did things very piecemeal. We looked at one thing at a time. And what our housing needs and strategies assessment does is it actually brought together all the pieces that we need. It looked at our current situation in Golden around housing and demographics. It also looks at our anticipated need, what the future may hold for Golden, and then it identifies for us strategies or actions that we could take that would actually make a difference. So you probably all know in your cities the people who say, oh, if we would just adopt this policy or program, like for us, it's always like what Denver did or what Boulder did or someone else, then that would solve affordable housing. And we all know that what works in one city may not work in our own city. It may have limited success or limited impacts. And so understanding our unique situation, understanding our growth patterns and what to expect will really allow us to dial into strategies that work for us here in Golden. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing housing. It's not cookie cutter, it's not easy, but completing our own housing needs and strategies assessment that is specific to our city gives us those tools now to really be able to enact new policies and programs that will be impactful and will allow us to move towards our goals a lot more intentionally, and hopefully accomplish things a lot sooner. So I'm still really excited about the assessment. I think every city should do one. I am going around telling everybody they should do one. So if you haven't started, hopefully you'll learn something from us today and can get excited to kick off your own assessment. So I'm going to turn things over to Janet to talk about how we got the assessment done. And then since we've adopted it on City Council at the end of last year, how we formed the Affordable Housing Committee and some of the work that is ongoing at this point. So Janet, I will turn it to you.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. And thank you for your leadership on this very important issue. So today, I think our goal really is not to tell you the findings of our housing needs assessment, but really to show you what we did in our structure that actually produced the results that we were really pretty happy with. And if you have questions related to that, we can always show you our housing needs assessment, but the goal for us is to really sort of just give you a model that might help you as you think about yours. So we're going to cover a couple of things today. First of all, how we identified our funding, the scope of work, our RFP development process, the importance of our community input in this process, and then identifying and addressing those challenges. And then, of course, Rick's going to talk a little bit more about once the council had adopted that plan, what the next steps are for us going forward. So I'm going to move this dial slowly. Let's see. So I wanted to walk you through the different tasks, and Denise had sent out a handout because we really have limited time here. I thought it'd be better if we could actually show you a little more in depth on what the scope of work is for each of the items. So let's just see if this is going to change for me here. There we go. Nope, well, wrong way. Sorry, guys. Slowly but surely. One more. There we go. So we started off with when we were talking about our RFP development and eventually getting to the scope of work, or what are some of the questions that we really wanted to answer. And it was really in two parts. First of all, we wanted to get a better understanding of where we were today. What were the challenges of our current residents, our workforce? What were the challenges that we had, and what were our existing housing gaps? And then working from there, what will the future growth of the city, be it the future workforce, the future growth of population, the impact, as the mayor mentioned, of the Colorado School of Mines. How will all of these different growth potentials impact our future housing needs? And then a very important part is the barriers that exist of housing, on the cost of housing development. Golden, like we mentioned, is a very small city, very landlocked city. We have lots of beautiful mesas around us, but it doesn't give us a lot of places to build housing. And so how can we maximize the land that we do have and minimize the cost of housing development with our resources? So I'm going to walk you through the different tasks of our housing needs assessment and how we work to answer those questions. So the first one, task one, was our project startup and baseline conditions. So very important thing was for us was we wrote an RFP based on what we thought we need. We had 3 responses to those RFPs, that all addressed our RFP requirements in different ways. And so our goal was really pick the one that made the best sense for us. And they all had strengths and weaknesses. And so what was really important in the very beginning on our kickoff meeting was to kind of get on the same page with our contractor, making sure they had the same understanding of the scope of work that we had of the scope of work, and that we were working on a very clear definition. So we had a kickoff meeting, we had a scope of work development that was a very important task before we even started launching into things. And then we started really with, what do we have now? What did our economic base historically, our labor force trends historically look like? And how did that give us sort of a base for the city? And then based on that, what were the housing gaps analysis that currently exist? Our existing housing inventory compared to our need. We have, like the mayor mentioned, we have a lot of jobs and less housing. We have 2.3 jobs for every housing unit in the city, which is a very, very high number. About 95% of our people who work in Golden do not live in Golden. And it has a lot to do with this availability, with stock, with cost of housing. And so we wanted to look at all that. We did an analysis of our deed restricted housing and our naturally occurring affordable housing. We have about 250 units of formally deed restricted housing, LIHTC units, HUD units, those types of housing within the city. But we also have naturally occurring housing. We have 2 mobile home parks that have historically been great home ownership opportunities for the folks that have lived there. And that's shifting for us a little bit. So we're starting to kind of look at those patterns of growth, those things that are changing. And that's kind of where we were moving forward in future tasks. Giving it time to change a minute here. Let's see. The second task, I'll jump forward and we'll let the slides catch up, was very, very important to us. And that is that we really needed to understand this from a Golden lens. So it wasn't just about having consultants step in and say, okay, here's what the data says, and here's what you should do because this is what the data says and this is what everybody else does. We really wanted to understand and have a Golden voice in our housing needs assessment. So this gave us a chance to really do some primary housing market research, and that is we had stakeholder interviews. We reached out to some of the large management companies in the city, some of our realtors, some of our housing developers, both for-profit and affordable housing developers, some of our advocacy groups, and asked them specifically to talk about what they had seen in the city historically, how housing had developed, the investment of that, what they were seeing in development costs and barriers, as well as who was buying and who was renting in the city. So taking into that involved about a week-long process of one-on-one interviews with those key stakeholders to really dig deep into the data the consultants were seeing, matched up with the data that only really personal experience can provide from the stakeholders. And then the second part of that was a community housing survey. So for us, that was an online survey that our consultants designed. to really dig deep into, you know, what types of folks were living in Golden, what were their housing tenure, were they homeowners, were they renters, how long had they been there, what were their housing costs, what were their challenges. And if you look at the handout, a lot of that information will be in the handout with regards to what that community survey contained. We had a really great response rate, and it was very representative of the broad spectrum of folks that were living in Golden, and gave us the ability to do some projecting from that. Our third task was letting my slides catch up here. Hang on, there we go. Our housing needs projections. So we have our baseline, we have the gaps that we've analyzed that exist today. We've looked at, taken our stakeholder input. And the third task was really looking at the needs projection. So we're really looking at a 10-year needs projection on our growth in Golden. So again, looking back toward how our households are changing in Golden. What is the projected growth? There was lots of information on our data from the state, from COG, even from our local sources about the growth and projected growth. We could see from employers in the city, from growth in the region as well. And based on that, we were able to do some housing needs projections, and that was by housing type, rental versus home ownership, by price point. It was very neat to see that they were able to project by AMI, so area median income. We could look at how many units we might need in the 30 to 50% range, how many we might need in the 60 to 80% range, how many we might need in the 100 to 120% range, and even over 120% of AMI. One of the surprising findings for us was we have a big need for housing over 120% of AMI, because we have a large sort of what we'll call a missing middle in Golden. And so that was very illuminating. We were able to project the number of units that might be needed in the next 10 years based on growth patterns, but also project them by type of housing, rental, home ownership, and by the income needs of the particular future residents of Golden. And then the fourth task, which I thought was really valuable, and I think we've seen this as our committee has worked on potential zoning and code changes, is the economic analysis of housing development. And it was a big reason that we actually selected the contractor that we did, because they had a really strong financial analysis background, and they were able to look at building costs that they had obtained from the stakeholders, that they could do an analysis of particular development cost within the city, and where were those costs coming from. So the first part of this was we had about 3 or 4 parcels of land in the city that we'd identified that could be available for future development, whether that's affordable or market rate development. It could be available for housing development. They were able to take those representative sites, look at the zoning on them, and be able to develop look at what could be developed on those particular sites and the types of housing that might be available with specific the density that's allowed, the parking requirements, and the other factors that influence housing development. So I'm going to pop to the next slide on task 4. And that was, we were able to look at the particular real estate factors as well on this one. So that would be a real estate economic analysis, and that was looking at future housing needs that could be addressed by market rate development. So what is market rate development naturally going to provide in that? So Denise, if it's not advancing, I'd just advance one more slide for me. There you go. What would future housing needs that market rate development could provide? And then of the housing production gaps, what is there in the absence of subsidies or incentives or the government stepping in? Where are those gaps that we need to think about doing something about, making adjustments or filling? And what impacts do construction costs, the regulatory requirements, and those municipal impact fees have on the affordability of housing in Golden? So as we develop that housing, what are the costs that really affect the cost of development? And I wanted to, if you go one more slide for me, Denise, the I wanted to pull one slide out of our housing needs assessment to show you an example of what I thought was very valuable and really did have some impact. And that is what essentially we took our the contractors took our existing development code right now and said, if we developed vertical mixed use apartments, which is 1A right there, based on current code, based on current requirements, based on a normal return the developer's expecting, what price point could we reach with that vertical mixed use apartment? And they came up with it would reach the 153% or higher of AMI, so area median income. So in Golden, that's well into the six figures. You're probably looking at about $160,000 of income to be able to afford a vertical mixed use apartment at the current zoning code. The 1B example is the exact same product, but we do some adjustments. We do adjustments for increasing density. We do adjustments for reducing parking, different adjustments on the sliding scale. And if you want to do a deep dive into our housing needs assessment, read this chapter about 4 times because it is very, very in depth on the analysis and cost. But if we made those changes, you can see by doing those adjustments to the requirements, we were able to take the housing cost, the cost to build down, and we were then able to reach households at about 110% of AMI. So that doesn't get us to the 30 or the 60 or the 50% of AMIs that we know there's a need for, but there's also programs and resources for. But we do need to also figure out the spectrum of absent housing in Golden as well. So that was a great example there with that slide of just ways you can kind of move the requirements that are in the current code to adjust the housing cost. So finally, task 5, we had, it was really just presenting the report. We did a draft report presentation to our council in September of 2022. We took their input back. We also ran that after we presented to council and took their input. They wanted to see a little bit more input from the community groups. So we actually presented to a planning commission. We presented to our urban redevelopment authority, which is called GURA, and our Golden Chamber of Commerce to get their input into the study, make some changes, and take the final report back to council in October 2022, which is when they adopted that. So, and the final slide I'll talk about before I turn it over to Rick is really sort of the community engagement piece, and that is really the community input piece for us was important. If you can pop one more slide, Denise. It was, we did a couple of things that our folks got pretty focused on the number of units that needed to be built that the report called for, because it was a large number of units for the little Golden. And so we kind of had to reassure them that that was really just a report with data, that there needed to be further analysis and further steps, and that we needed to sort of focus on a lot of the other issues that came out of the report. Our communications team did this really cool graphic that showed just some of the big findings in our housing needs assessment. The fact that home prices had doubled since 2015. We had a 28% increase in rental rates. So these examples here were just a way to graphically share with our community what some of the findings were, other than having them read the 171-page report. And so this was a great way to do that. So I'll turn that over to Rick and let him talk about sort of the next steps from here and where we're going with all of this information and how do we make it Golden specific.
Great, thank you, Janet, and thank you all for your interest in this topic. Janet really did a detailed job of walking through the creation of the housing needs assessment, and so she did a lot of the heavy lifting there. But I'll take it from there and talk about our next steps after that. So if we could advance the slide one more, thank you. After this housing needs assessment was created and reviewed thoroughly, it was adopted by our city council in late 2022. And they quickly pivoted to establish a affordable housing trust fund, and this is essentially, a bank account for future funding that would come our way for affordable housing development in the future. So that could include Proposition 123 funding, other grants as they are made available as well as any dedicated funds that the city decides to implement in our budget. So that is an important thing to establish from Golden's perspective to at least have that going. And then the city council also appointed an affordable housing committee to start working on this problem and how it is specific to Golden and our affordable housing issues. So this affordable housing committee is made up of local community members from a variety of backgrounds. We have a city councilor on the committee. We have a former planning commissioner and realtor on the committee. We have two folks from the development world, as well as a couple people from the affordable housing world, one representing the community land trusts and one representing our regional housing authority. And also some grassroots organizers as well for affordable housing. So it was important to create that diverse background for that committee so that all of those voices could be represented when they actually reviewed the housing needs assessment and decided where Golden should go from there. So they had a lot of homework ahead of them when they signed up to be on this committee. The housing needs and strategies assessment, as Janet mentioned, is a very dense document, lots of great data in there and lots of great technical information, but it's a lot to get through. But that means it's good because they did a very thorough job. So once they did their homework, they decided to talk through a number of different policy considerations, regulatory considerations in order to move the needle in Golden. What out of this housing needs assessment can we focus on in Golden that's specific to Golden and would make the most difference? And their ultimate task is to then create a set of recommendations to send to City Council for Council's direction from there. So I'll just give you a few things that came out of that review and those conversations. It was a lively series of meetings that the group had, and a lot of it because it focused on barriers. And Golden, like most communities, has a number of barriers set up that prevent affordable housing from being developed. Not necessarily that it can't be developed, but it adds costs oftentimes as well. So the regulatory, to give you a few examples of the regulatory considerations that they are putting forward in the recommendations, something that probably applies to all communities out there is parking regulations. And a lot of parking regulations have not been updated in a very long time. They're not very nuanced to speak to different types of incomes in housing, for example, when you're doing residential parking requirements. So we talked a lot about what can we do to reduce the burden of parking requirements and therefore reduce the burden on these the costs associated with affordable housing. And could there be some allowances to reduce the parking ratios where you have lower AMI, where studies show that lower income groups do drive less, have fewer cars, especially if the development in question is located in a transit-rich, pedestrian-friendly environment. So that is one of the things that we tackled with this group. Another one is that what we have in our code, in our zoning code, and I think this is common in other zoning codes as well, is restrictions on residential development in our mixed-use districts. I think this is fairly common based on our research, but a lot of our future opportunities for sites in Golden are in these mixed-use commercial areas, not in our established neighborhoods. There's a number of underdeveloped commercial properties. And there's also a lot of studies that were overdeveloped as far as commercial in this country in general. So we wanted to make sure that there's an opportunity to open up some of these areas for affordable housing too. And so one of the barriers we have in our code, in our zoning code, is that you have to have a commercial component to these developments, even if the majority of it is residential. So are there some allowances that could allow for 100% residential in these commercial districts, as long as it's affordable in the definitional sense of affordable housing? And then one of the things that we talked about a lot, and it's very particular to Golden, we have a 1% growth ordinance in Golden. I suspect most communities have some type of restriction that is not the same as this, but something that you individually would need to address. But our growth ordinance limits the number of residential units that can be built in any given year. And so, this can create a lot of uncertainty for affordable housing developers, especially for financing and the length of time it takes to put together some of these affordable housing deals, both the land as well as getting the funding for the development itself. So you know, there's a lot of talk about, are there possible exemptions from our 1% growth ordinance associated with affordable housing? That's, of course, particular to Golden, but you probably have your own issues like that in your communities. So from this, this group is creating a whole list of priorities for City Council, and this is actually in the works as we speak. We're sending the council packet out later this week, and that will be for City Council to take it from there and provide direction to staff. And so our next steps for Golden will be to take council direction after all of this work and all of this engagement process, and then set about the task of actually making some changes, whether to our regulatory environment, to programs that we make available, and other opportunities that we create. And I think our next slide, if we could advance, just talks about the resources. This is what I was alluding to in talking about the resources that we used for our affordable housing committee. So we have that housing needs assessment RFP and the scope of work on our website. You can go to guidinggolden.com, and that link for housing is very prominent on that website. You can see the assessment itself, the committee, and the work that the committee is doing. We're also part of a National League of Cities Healthy Housing Initiative that folds into the affordable housing conversation as well. And then we have resources for our unhoused and at-risk residents of Golden, including our Housing Navigator program. So all of that is there available on Guiding Golden for your perusal, and we're happy to answer any questions about that. And I think I will turn it over to Mayor Weinberg now to close out the presentation and open up the questioning.
Thank you. Yeah, great overview, Janet, Rick, and as they said, we're open for questions, but I just wanted to wrap up with a couple of thoughts. And the first is that, you know, as we mentioned multiple times, the assessment, the recommendations, the work was very specific to Golden. Even the outreach, each of our communities has its own groups of residents, of business, of stakeholders that we need to engage in this process. And by bringing them into the conversation, by having them at the table, that's where we can gain a lot of success. And then just to, you know, kind of share the excitement. We have done a national community survey in Golden. We do it every 3 years now, and even before we started doing that, we would do periodic surveys. And for all of the surveys over time, at least for the last decade or more, housing has been a top priority for our community. So we can see over time, we can see in these statistically valid surveys that when folks, you know, respond and they say, what is the biggest issue for your community? Housing has been at the top. So we know both that it's a concern for our community, that folks, you know, want us to do something as a city. And now we have the information to share and the tools to be able to say, you know, here are ways that we can move forward in Golden that will actually help, you know, address our challenges. And so, you know, both connecting the community, hearing their concerns, bringing them to the table, and then doing the work to be able to share this type of assessment. And going forward, at the end of this month, we'll be talking about it at City Council about what things we're going to prioritize to work on next. Hopefully we'll have the community along with us, because I know when we get into housing conversations, that's often where it gets stuck as to, you know, where, you know, new housing should go, and you know, some resistance there, but we're seeing less and less in that as we have more community engagement and involvement. But with that, I think, you know, we're open to any questions. As Janet, as Rick mentioned, you know, if anybody's interested, the material and all of our specific information about our assessment is online on our website.
Right, and I'll kind of pop back in here. Thank you all for your sharing your expertise and your lessons learned on this. I'm not seeing any questions in our question box yet, but one came to mind for me that might be helpful for those who are in attendance today too, is that just curious as you talk through your process, and you had all touched on kind of knowing kind of some of the demographics of your community, being a college town, being a place that many people drive into work from and whatnot. But were there any surprises in the results and the recommendations of the assessment? And I open that up to any of you who want to answer that.
I think for me, I was surprised at the impact on our workforce. The fact that 95% of our workforce does not live in the city of Golden. And I think, if there was a chance to do a further deep dive, what impact does that have on our businesses and what they have to pay our employees in order to get them to work in the city of Golden if that many folks have to drive into Golden every day. So I think that was surprising to me, how many people did not live in Golden who actually work in Golden. But when our median home price is $1 million, you kind of understand why. And yet our city is very much a tourism city. I mean, everybody goes to Golden because you get to eat at great restaurants and you get to enjoy the river and all of the great things that involve a tourist economy, a tourism economy, and that really talks about the service sector in its response. So how do we provide that housing for that service sector?
I don't know that there were any specifics in there that were surprising because, we've been looking at this for a long time. The biggest surprise for me was the conclusions you're able to draw when you pull all of it together in one place. So, yes, when you look at the demographics somewhere else and you say, okay, we understand we have this many seniors in our community and this many youth and, families and all of that. But then when you tie it to the existing housing in the city and, the type of housing stock we have and the size of that housing and, starting to be able to draw conclusions about potentially this disconnect we have of all of these large single family homes that were built in, really post World War II and up to recently, very large, multiple bedroom homes that aren't necessarily connecting with the size of family that we have, seniors, 1-2 people in a home, or younger families with no children, and we have a lot of really large single family homes. So, having all of that together, both the existing housing and the demographics and looking at the trends, I think that's what really, I think, allows the conversation to move forward, because it's all in one place in a way that allows you to draw conclusions about, well, what do we need? What actually is missing, not just from an income standpoint, but actual housing, the types of housing that are needed to meet the needs of the people that are here.
Great, thank you. And yep, still no questions coming in. So I just want to remind everybody, this is a chance to ask your questions on what the process was like or what it is as you're approaching your own from people who've gone through this, right? Experts that have kind of gone through this already. But
I'm just gonna add a thought, because I know I've heard from a city recently who said one of the challenges now that we did not have when we got started was the difficulty in finding a consultant or finding someone, because so many people are engaging in this work now. So we were fortunate in starting early that we had 3 responses to our RFP, and I understand some cities, are only receiving 1 or having trouble finding that work. And I think that's a very real problem as more cities engage in this and, want to do the work or get the funding from DOLA. And as Janet mentioned, it's really, while that 1 RFP response, you get maybe what your city needs, they are all different. We got 3 different responses with different expertise and focus. And so I encourage you to kind of stick with it and don't settle. Make sure you find the right provider, the right contractor to do this work that's going to work well with your city, because that's what's going to get, I think, the results that you're looking for and the information that you need to move forward.
Great advice. And it can be challenging right now with RFPs and cities.
Yeah. If I can add to that, DOLA does have a contractor list for these housing needs assessments. If and I think it's on their 1271 website. So if you guys are having challenges, you might look to see that we actually emailed our RFP out to the entire DOLA contracting list, as well as other organizations that, and the usual places we posted, but also other organizations we knew might be interested.
That's helpful, Janet. And I think when we send up our follow-up email on that, we can provide some links to that as well, maybe to make it easy for people to find. Well, how about, just kind of curious, was there any critical data missing from the assessment? Like on hindsight now, something you might have thought of that you didn't think of until, we don't know what we don't know until we suddenly don't realize we don't know it, right? So.
Again, if we had a million years to do this work, I think I would have liked to have seen more tools, more resources. What had other cities done, especially cities that were like Golden, that had already been successful? When you're stepping into this work, a lot of times everybody else is trying things alongside you, and we don't have historical data on programs that have worked over the long term. But if there was the case studies, examples, they had these scenarios and they did this shift. I read something about if the parking goes away, what will happen, and the impact that sometimes has had on communities, the right communities, in being able to stabilize their growth of the rents. And so just learning scenarios and examples like that, I think would be super helpful. It's not necessarily data, but yeah.
That's great. And that kind of leads maybe into a follow-up question to that. On now that you've kind of been through this process, and hearing from you on that, Janet, I think you kind of addressed this, but I'd look to Rick or Laura to see if you had experience pointers. Is there anything you would have done to change for a better outcome, or I think like lessons learned that you would have helped, that might be advice you can pass on to others starting this process, or even if they're midway, right? So.
I'll start. Rick, you add in, but one just high level, and I have told this to other cities as they were getting close to completing theirs. The preparing your community for the information they are going to see. It's a dense report. There's a lot of data and information in there, and people can interpret it in their own ways. And it's important to, even if they've been part of it, until they see the results and these outside recommendations, right? These are outside companies, you've hired consultants, to come in and take a look at your city, and they're going to present the information and recommendations, not all of which your city is going to agree with or want to move forward with. And so preparing your community for what that outcome, or for what that report is going to be, and how you are going to process that information, move forward with it, so that you don't have any folks making their own interpretations or assumptions, or, as Janet mentioned, getting really concerned about something they see and they're like, oh my gosh, we only have 8,000 some odd units in Golden, and the report's saying we're going to build 2,000 more, or something that really creates community concern. Even though it's not realistic as, something that's going to happen. It's just information. That's the reality. What you do with it, the policies that you choose to move forward with, that's where the community and the council and the city work. So I would say prepare your community in advance for how you're going to move forward with all of this great information that you're going to see, because that's not the recommendations that you're going to adopt and implement.
Yeah, and I'll just say, and this is somewhat related, but I would just say that, this is we've mentioned many times, this is a very technical document when you do one of these needs assessments, and people don't necessarily understand it. And it almost needs a user's guide, to sort of explain in plain English what this actually means, and what could be done about it in sort of simpler, non-technical terms could help your communication efforts with your community, just so that you get a broader base of understanding. And we have plenty of folks who can dive deep into this, but the general public often needs to have this, sort of teased out a bit to really fully understand it.
Great, I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left, but I'm not seeing other questions come in. So I think at this point, we can kind of give people back a little time in their day if they need a few more minutes between now and their next meeting. But I do want to thank you all, Laura, Rick, Janet, for your time as presenters today and sharing the experience and how you approach this that will be helpful to others going through this. That knowledge is very valuable, and knowledge sharing is a key thing here, right? So I also want to thank all of our attendees today. We know it's busy in the day, and so to take the time out and join us today is really gracious of you, and I'm hoping that you found some very valuable information here too that you can take back to the organizations you're working with. So once again, we will be sending out an email towards the end of the week that'll share the materials, that'll have the PowerPoint, the handout again, as well as a recording of the training, which will be posted on our website. So a link to that, and you'll be able to also find that stuff on our website towards the end of the week. But for attendees, we'll share that information so that you know how to get back in touch with our presenters, or at least have access to that information at your fingertips as you're moving forward. I just want to say thank you all again for joining us today. This kind of concludes our webinar, and I really hope you enjoy this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. I see sunshine outside, at least in Denver. So thank you all.